Okay, thank you very much, Mario. I'm very happy to be speaking to you, actually, and I have to say I'm also a bit anxious because it is the first time I think that I give a presentation about my current research to a group of people that are familiar with both circular economy studies and degrowth. Usually it's either people who are actually very much on degrowth, maybe, and they don't know the relation between that field of studies and circular economy, and less often, but it happens as well. It's people who are very much into circular economy, but do not know anything about degrowth. So I guess part of the presentation will be, especially the first part, will be a bit a repetition for you. But instead of changing and complicating my life, I decided just to keep it as it is, and maybe the narrative overall will make sense to you. And so, indeed, I will present the ideas, the first idea of the ERC project I'm working on, which builds on the previous work I did on degrowth and cities, which now is still continuing. But this project somehow takes its just specific angle to the study of degrowth in cities and urbanization at large. It combines, in fact, the critique of circular economy studies from a degrowth perspective. Now, why it is important to do that, to criticize the circular economy from a degrowth perspective? We know that by 2050, cities, urbanization, in fact, will demand the double amount of raw materials of today. The gray section that you see there, it's actually the material stock related to, indeed, building materials, the built environment. Sand, concrete, steel, wood. We know that these projections actually of the doubling of raw materials globally are also not evenly distributed globally. In Africa, we'll have an increase of about 850% by 2040. In fact, in India and China is about 350%. In Europe is less, of course, it's about 40%. But the overall picture shows, in fact, that there is an increased urgency to think in terms of reducing raw material demands from an urban point of view. At the same time, cities and urbanization will actually produce 70% more waste in the same time span. Now, when I say cities, it's because, in fact, if we look at industrial areas, non-urbanized industrial areas or areas of extractions, a lot of waste that is produced there tend to be already pretty much reused, so considered as some sort of secondary material for new productions. But a lot of the waste instead produced by cities, which includes, of course, non-household waste, is increasing dramatically. Now, this is an image that everybody of you know, but I tend to always put it there because this increase in material demand, it's one of those things that, in fact, are not being decoupled from the increase of GDP. I'm not going to explain anything about decoupling here to this audience. You know already enough of this, but this image shows very well that even though we might be illuded that there is a possibility of relative, if not absolute decoupling, relative to CO2 emissions, actually, when we take the material footprint of the economy, so far, historically, we have no sign that of even relative decoupling. Now, I look at urbanization to deal with this problem because it's quite clear already since the mid-80s, early 80s. So let's say the phase in which early countries of early industrialization started to post-industrialize, to deindustrialize. It's been already clear that cities have become the actually motors of the economic growth of nations. So when we talk about GDP of nations, we are talking about the growth machine that is working through the development of urban and built environment, in particular dense urban environments. This was very clear in the 80s when John Logan and Harvey Mollich studied the so-called urban growth machines, so basically the capital switch from industrial manufacturing to real estate. But it became even more clear in the early 2000s with the IT revolution, let's say, that cities were the space where value was realized. So the value of the IT industry was realized. The result is that, in fact, even though cities cover just 2% of the planet's surface, they consume 75% of all materials consumed in the economy globally. More importantly to say is that it's not all cities that are equally responsible for this, but there are some cities in the world that actually consume more materials and, of course, also concentrate the highest share of GDP. Actually, the top 600 cities cover 2/3 of the global GDP. It's not a surprise, of course, that also the construction sector, next, by the way, to the fossil fuel and energy sector and commodity sector, the construction sector is a large share of the GDP of nations, while being also one of the largest emitters of emissions and waste. So this is why I approach this problem of material reduction looking at urbanization. So the challenge we have in front of us is to slow down, downscale, and close the social metabolism of cities, which is in fact the overall amount and also speed of stuff, materials that is extracted, processed, and wasted by or to and from urban agglomerations. So this is what I understand as a critique of the circular economy, which is about slowing down, downscaling, closing loops from a degrowth perspective. And of course, in order to problematize circular economy, I particularly look at how it is realized and regulated in cities. Now, you probably might think, okay, this guy has another definition of degrowth, one of the many. I give you just a quick one, but I give this definition usually to make clear a bit how, in what type of terms I think about degrowth. And of course, this definition encapsulates many more critiques. But in some, degrowth in this vein is understood as downscaling of of all activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating, starting from those that are less necessary, of course, for the well-being of humans and the environment. But at the same time, when we look at urbanization, in fact, degrowth is also a planned increase or improvement of all those activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs. Okay, of course, this is in a democratic and equitable way, but the point of stressing the increase, I think it's important for urban studies and degrowth, is that we're talking about a system that attempts to deliver affordable, high-quality housing for everybody, green space, mobility options, education, and public services, universal public services in cities. So, and these services are the ones that have been decreasing in the last 30 years of neoliberalization. Now, the critique is the growth definition is founded upon many evidences, but for my presentation, probably the most important are, the first is that it's clear that the amount of material and material stock in a particular economy, in this case, a national economy, does not relate to an increase in social progress. This is just another, let's say, evidence of what we can call the Easterling paradox. Basically, the evidence that up to a certain point there is an increase in quality of life, even when there is an increase in stuff, in material stuff. But this increase flattens relatively quickly, in fact. And we have situations of countries like Germany or Czech Republic, where in fact, social progress index is not comparable even to it's at the same level of that of Costa Rica. The reason of this disparity, it's because, of course, Germany or Czech Republic are they have very material intensive economies, so mining in particular. Germany is the mining site of Europe. That's where sand in particular and coal are extracted in Western Europe, in fact. The other evidence that sustain, let's say, the definition of degrowth that I gave is the fact that an ecological problem is not a technological one. It's actually a social justice issue. This study is quite known by now. I'm sure you know it. It shows very clearly that, in fact, even if we don't take the global north, global south divide as an element to establish ecological responsibility, we see that in fact there is a clear distinction or a clear difference in contribution in ecological destruction between the top incomes and the bottom incomes. So top 10% incomes in Europe, for example, emit 6 times more CO2 than the bottom 50%. And the same picture works in any other country, also global south countries. Moreover, there are studies that show that this disparity is very clear between the urban and the rural. So the top 10% incomes, the wealthier, are also those that buy more properties and more goods and more investments in economies that are situated in dense urban environment, like the financial economy or the real estate economy. Now, when we approach the urban, the slowing down, the closing, and the downscaling of the urban metabolism, from a degrowth perspective, there is a lot of work out there that has already dealt with this issue. Most of the works that we find in the degrowth literature today, in fact, point at the practices that tend to value materials for social purposes through practices of conviviality, oriented to to sufficiency or reduction. Basically, these are practices that combine convivial methods, convivial technologies to create meaningful social relationship, just like bike repair or community gardens or housing co-ops built by wood and completely circular, like this one that I contributed to design here in Amsterdam. Now, these projects are inspiring, and of course, they're very interesting. However, they have a limit. In fact, while this literature points very well at the urgency to downscale material demands, it has not yet offered indication of how the overall metabolism of cities or of urbanization needs to be regulated. In fact, the critique of this literature is that it focuses a lot on prefiguration. So it's showing how the future urban lifestyle would look like, but it does not address, in fact, the system of rules and norms and institutions that regulate material flows that move through cities. So that's the problem I like to address in my research. To address this problem also means, in fact, to come to terms to the fact that the amount of stuff that comes to cities every day, it's huge. And a project like this, while being inspiring, do not address that fundamental problem. That's why I actually approached circular economy. I decided to study a bit what is told there, what is written there, because I think in the field of industrial ecology and environmental economics, and particularly industrial ecology and material stock analysis, when applied to cities, there was a lot of research showing that there were different models to regulate the urban metabolism. Circular economy, in the sense, is a socio-technical approach to progress, in fact, that aim to reduce material demands by valuing waste as an economic asset. This is my definition of the 1,000 definition you can find online. But this graph on the right makes you somehow understand what I mean. If we take the usual linear economy of production, distribution, consumption, and waste, we see that we miss a whole set of value-generating activities that, in fact, are often displaced in other parts of the world where labor is cheaper and ecological costs are also not accounted for. The circular economy, when applied to countries, to regions of the world like the global north, or even more, let's take Europe, what it does is that it creates economic activities of something that has lost value. So a waste, let's say a wasted laptop that gets redesigned, repurposed, split, open up and turn apart, and with the parts are remade in order to produce new things. This is all value creation, economic value creation, jobs, research and design, apps, models, all kind of tools that are actually supposed to increase economic growth, but in a way that is sustainable. That's basically the idea of the circular economy. And in fact, when you ask experts of circular economy to quantify the potential value of circular economy for cities, they actually show you stuff like this. They show you the so-called circularity gap. There was a study in Amsterdam done a few years ago where they actually measured the circularity gap of the city, and that was the time when Amsterdam was started to implement circular economy policies. And they show basically that the gap, which is a gap in uncaptured value, is made of all that stuff that is going to become future waste, so stock depletion, and that at the moment is not captured or is not reused. Now, why Europe has a big circularity gap is because Europe is a continent of old urbanization. All our infrastructures have been built mostly after the Second World War. And the system through which we build those infrastructures, I mean the materials and the technologies we use to build those infrastructures, are gonna be obsolete by usually in 50, 70 years. In fact, now, the reason why schools collapse in the UK is because infrastructure are getting old. The reason why German trains are in a disastrous condition is because the whole railway has been built mostly in those periods, so 50, 60 years ago. The same reason is, for example, why the docks of the Amsterdam canals are now being renovated completely. We see, in fact, that there is a huge, in fact, large amount of material stock coming in cities that makes cities, in fact, future urban mines. The same works, by the way, with non-inert materials like residual heat. There are studies that shows, in fact, that there is a huge potential to reuse residual heat around urban regions in order to fulfill the energy needs of cities. Now, I'm not arguing for this. This is, let's say, the picture that is depicted by neoclassical circular economy studies, if you can call it that way. Now, why do I approach it next to degrowth? It's because, in fact, if we look at how things are defined, we see that degrowth and circular economy somehow point at a common concern, common problem. They basically say waste as today somehow is used as an object matter, something that nobody wants. It's disposed of and shipped somewhere where cheap labor can process it. Is basically waste has a low social, ecological, and monetary value, and that's why, in fact, the system of wasteful consumerism does persist. This is one of the reasons why this system of wasteful consumerism persists. However, degrowth frames this problem as saying that waste is a product of a society that, in fact, perpetuates increased consumption and production through the devalorization of labor and environment, and therefore through the possibility of producing waste as obsolete material. The circular economy instead says waste has indeed a low economic value, and therefore it is a product, in fact, of forms of production and consumption that are low in economic value and low in monetary value. So, in fact, what the issue of distinction here is the way value and waste is framed and addressed. However, degrowth clearly understands the valorization of waste as a pathway to an ecologically conscious society. Basically, it says if we consider waste the bad side of our current growth-dependent economy, and we value it for what it is, which is an increase in damage and in both social and ecological terms, we might shift to a society that is ecologically conscious, that deal with it, and therefore also prevents it, so reduces it. Mainstream circular economy instead does frame waste as a new cycle and as an opportunity for economic growth. In fact, in an article published in 2019, I really argue that the circular economy is one of the most recent ways through which capitalism is actually resolving its contradiction, the contradiction between increase in production and consumption, and therefore increase in raw materials demand, and therefore increase in prices of raw material demands, and increase in waste. So they are basically trying to solve two problems with one solution. Or how do you say in Holland? You say to kill two birds with one stone. But I don't like very much the birds metaphor. By the way, on the right, you see just one of the communication campaigns of a circular pavilion here in Amsterdam, opened a few years ago, where basically it is through circularity that luxury meets sustainability. And you can buy great stuff to sell, to give as a present for Christmas there. In fact, what I did by, aware of these definitions, what I did then, I basically started to look in practice how circular economy and degrowth were actually somehow practiced in Amsterdam. And in fact, in a past study, I noticed that there were, in fact, different circular economies at place in the city. Some that were very clearly appealing to the degrowth framework based on sufficiency, and others that were instead appealing to more the green growth frameworks, but in different ways. In fact, in a paper, in a chapter, I used the metaphor of the good, the bad, and the ugly to somehow represent these three different circular economies. The three, you saw the movie, right?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, just to be sure, because I mean, I assume that people know the movie, but the point is that these three bandits are looking for the same goal. Yes, exactly. So the idea that the three bandits are all looking for the gold, and they help each other until the end, but at the end they're all looking for the same stuff, which is the gold that they don't want to share. Well, if we look at how waste and circular economy is dealt in cities, it's the same. We see different circular economy practices looking for the same stuff, which is waste, being, for example, organic waste to be compost. But at the end, they don't want to share it, because of course, the only way to divert waste is to take it from other forms of reuse. For example, divert it from incineration and using it for organic composting. And the risk here is that in order to solve this conflict, we do not question wasteful consumerism, and therefore we increase waste. That's a bit the paradox of this situation. Now, when I talked about values and how do we research that? So I am a sociologist by background, and I approach things from an institutional perspective always. That means that the way I frame, value, it's from a regulatory perspective. So the assumption is that waste does not exist as such, of course. What is waste is basically materials that are actually understood, regulated, instituted as unvaluable, so as waste. So they are constructed by, in fact, a system of regulations and social norms as well that define, for example, who is responsible for the processing of materials, how they are distributed geographically, and what are the underlying economic expectation behind those materials. This is the system that at one point understands something as value or not. This is also why, for example, if I throw away my phone, my phone would not be understood as waste by somebody else that needs a second-hand phone, just to give you an idea how this value is, after all, constructed and not intrinsic in the actual materials. And my argument is also that the regulatory infrastructure of materials basically is not a given. It's always the product of political processes that structure power between different actors. So in fact, mine is a political critique of regulations. Basically, the argument is that regulations are not static. Those regulations that define the value of materials and therefore the actual use of waste. They are contested, they are defended by different actors, especially in cities, and they are enacted. So they are not only words on paper, like let's say like a legal document, but they actually reflect everyday social practices, and in fact also reflect ideological prescriptions. So in building my framework, I took into consideration these theoretical assumptions plus others from Giddens and Armstrong. I'm not going to go into there because I don't have time here now, and produced a framework that somehow tries to explain how waste is valorized, and therefore to explain whether in fact waste is being reduced or not, or, in relation to wasteful consumerism. Basically, is a framework that attempt to explain whether practices manage, in fact, to prefigure a degrowth society, or rather turn into a green growth project. And these regulations are divided into three categories, which I call responsibility, speciality, and value. And I'm going to present them briefly to you and give you some examples. Responsibility. So why I chose to start with that? So if we look at how circular economy and degrowth deal with waste and materials, we see that both of them, in fact, question the way responsibilities for ecological destruction or waste emissions are regulated. In fact, the circular economy clearly shows that there is a new role of responsible consumers that needs to be more central in order to consume better, consume differently. But at the same time, also degrowth brings in visions of commoning, for example, and collective processes and infrastructures that shows how people, in fact, tend to take responsibility on their hands in order to reduce their waste, and also to develop a culture of non-wasteful consumerism, of conscious consumerism, often related to basic, of course, basic services. And that's why I think responsibilities are very important to take into consideration, because it clearly sets a distinction between practices that somehow reproduce a green growth or a circular growth agenda by stressing the role of individualism as in consumption, and practices instead that reject that agenda, or reject that vision by stressing the collective aspect of commoning, in particular commoning waste and materials. This is just an example of a project in Amsterdam that is very successful. Not only in Amsterdam, in fact, in the whole Netherlands, there is a federation of different initiatives under the same name that basically collects organic food, basically, to be given to poorer communities. Now, I'm not idealizing this project, and I'm just saying that responsibility, so the way responsibilities are regulated, is perhaps the first of all the regulations that we need to address. Also, by the way, the one that changes the fast. If you look at how they are addressed, also in national and urban and regional policies, we see that responsibility regulations are the one that changes the fastest. So if you take, for example, the extended producer responsibility, or the fact that we cannot at one point throw away organic waste anymore in the general garbage. These kind of norms, these are regulations. In fact, these kind of regulations are very quickly adopted, often by municipalities and city regions. So that's why I decided to start with this. They are the fastest and perhaps the most easy to look at. The second set of regulations are those that, in fact, regulate the distribution of materials, in particular, the infrastructure that organizes the circulations of materials in cities. So this is a different kinds of regulations that often play at the regional and national scale. But they're extremely important when we deal with the urban metabolism, because, in fact, they're able to organize in a path-dependent way, so in the long term, large streams of materials, and they eventually end up being some sort of iron cage that makes it harder for a new model or a new economic transition to happen. They have become path dependency. The infrastructures are path dependent by default. They are materials, they're underground, and they are huge. And here on the right, you see, for example, the residual heat network of the city of Amsterdam, which was, in fact, in the early 2000s, this is a late development, but in fact, the early projects of the 2000s was justified as a plan of circular reuse of waste, in particular by involving the incinerator company, which is the top left hub there. It's near the harbor of Amsterdam. And the point here is that this heating system end up being a cost that needs to be repaid. And in order to repay that cost, the city needs to develop its own economic GDP. So more houses, more jobs, more industry, in order to sustain the cost of this huge infrastructure, which was intended to reuse waste in a circular fashion. Now, when we look at how infrastructures are regulated, we can also here see different types of scales. So there are projects like the one I showed you before that take place in spaces that are, urban or regional in scale. I call them bioregional because they relate to the, in fact, to the flow of different materials and relate to the ecological properties of space. On the left, you see an area that is also called a circular green hub. It's an area where different functions, in fact, including many community-supported agriculture and many commoning functions, are relating to each other in a circular fashion. This area, however, which is located where the red round is on the right picture, is now being threatened by an alternative vision of circular economy, which includes an industrial synergy between the Port of Amsterdam, the Schiphol Airport, and the Green Port, which is in fact a logistical hub for flowers. As you know, Amsterdam has a huge flower logistics industry, and they are making a plan. They made a plan already in mid-2015 to actually build a new circular infrastructure of logistics. And in fact, is actually, as we speak, is actually threatening the activities of the social economy that I just described on the left. So here we see different regulations, realizing different vision of circular economy, one that applies more to the degrowth vision and others to the circular economy. Finally, the last set of regulations, and then I'm done, I promise, is those that in fact that establish in fact the the investments in material stocks. These are regulations that usually look like contracts and agreements, or we can call them declaration of intent, all kind of little tools that neoliberal governments these days use in order to bypass democratic accountability. They are actually very powerful because they establish future expectation on economic benefits or risks from reusing waste. They are usually hidden, these regulations. They are the most difficult to find, in fact, when we do empirical research. But they tell a lot because they set the ground for indeed the infrastructural investments and also the responsibilities that I just explained. And perhaps the one example to show how these regulations play in practice is to compare, for example, the contracts that the city makes in Amsterdam to deliver waste to the incinerator with practices of commoning that try to value, in fact, land and their product, including the organic waste of those agricultural activities, as a new, ecological, social contribution to the well-being of the city. I'm going to explain. On the left, you see a very interesting, let's say, result of what happened when we think in terms of circular economy in a green growth fashion. The city of Amsterdam, in order to in fact fuel the incinerator and that would deliver residual heat, so sustainable heat as they define it, to homes, they signed a contract for 50 years with the incinerator, promising to deliver waste there. Now, if wasteful consumption reduces, so if people in Amsterdam produce less waste, there is basically a gap to fill in the incineration capacity of that infrastructure. And this gap is now being filled with import of organic waste from abroad. We are basically importing waste from South America and, at the moment, UK and Italy. You probably heard about the trains of waste coming from Rome to Amsterdam. Rome is delivering their trash to Amsterdam in order to actually generate, residual heat here in the city. On the other hand, on the right, you see protest movements that tries to, in fact, tries in fact to institutionalize ecological and social understanding of the value of waste. They in fact make plans, and they do make agreements based on, with community land trust that establish that the land, so in this case, and its products, so the fruit and their waste, have a social ecological value. I mean, this is a bit of an unexplored field for regulatory analysis, but I think it shows very well that the contestation of value here is a contestation of the norms, of the regulations that establish that value. It's not an abstract contestation. Now, so my research agenda at this point is, in fact, to develop this degrowth critique of the circular economy, looking, in fact, at how waste is valorized in urbanized capitalism. Now, I mentioned capitalism, of course, because this is absolutely crucial. We need to, the hypothesis is that the circular economy is a way to solve a contradiction of capitalism. So we need to question that aspect. And in order to do that, we need to problematize, in fact, or investigate different specific regulations and the way social practices interacts with them in this process of instituting value of materials. So thank you very much for listening. A bit of self-promotion is always good. Some of this work has been built on recent work I've done with other people about, indeed, the implication of degrowth principles for urbanization, and the book on the left tries to address this issue. And all what I said now, it's summarized in a paper that was recently published that you find here on the right, if you are interested in seeing more of this. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long, Mario.
No, I think that's was great.